The Grief of an Unlived Life, a guided sleep meditation for healing. Right now, a heavy, hollow, cave-like emptiness is situated directly behind your breastbone. A cold sensation of internal drift that makes you feel as though your center of gravity has detached completely from the present moment. You are lying in the darkness, yet your mind is consuming itself with the quiet, corrosive sorrow of an unlived life, grieving the paths, creative risks, and authentic callings you did not pursue because you were too busy choosing the safe, conventional expectations of your peers. It is the specific midnight weight of the unattempted road, a silent mourning for an alternate version of yourself that never got to breathe. An analytical panic whispers that by choosing security over internal alignment, you have turned your own existence into a permanent waiting room, leaving you to live as an invisible spectator in a story that was supposed to be your own. The immediate space around your bed has assumed a raw, alpine stillness tonight, filled with the faint trace scent of cold sulfur dust and the damp chill of wet canvas drifting through the small gaps in the floor joints. Outside, the hollow, irregular sound of a metal needle spinning aimlessly on a brass housing reveals that the night requires absolutely no fixed coordinates to remain perfectly vast. Inside this room, you are entirely released from the obligation to construct a destiny, justify your past caution, or prove that you have made something remarkable out of your years. Yet, your intellect is likely still pacing through the archive of your old crossroads, replaying the moments you chose to stay safe, and treating this private evening as an indictment of your courage. Please know, dear friend, that you are not broken, and the profound, heavy regret you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure or a sign that you have ruined your chance at completeness. What you are feeling is the natural, aching exhaustion of a spirit that has spent its life functioning like a bundle of unspun hemp fibers, left resting loose on a dark cedar shelf, absorbing the deep, earthy scent of the floor without ever being twisted into twine or forced into a finalized design. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be silent, nor will we demand that you magically erase your sense of lost time to deserve the comfort of this bed. There is no requirement for you to be fully realized, perfectly aligned, or completely healed before your body is permitted to sink into the dark. We are simply inviting that hollow vacuum behind your sternum to drop its protective density, trusting the heavy earth to hold your unformed life without any judgment. This exhausting grief over unchosen futures carries a beautiful and surprising paradox. The very timeline you mourn as a tragic loss is actually the threshold to a pristine, unconditioned freedom. The analytical mind falsely insists that your identity is an unfinished consumer product that failed to materialize, convincing you that you must find a way to retroactively fix your history to find peace. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that your essential awareness has never been a linear track to be completed. It is the wide, timeless sky in which all paths, taken or untaken, appear and dissolve without altering your core completeness. You do not exist to manifest a grand, visible destiny. For the validation of the valley, your presence is fully complete even when you are entirely uncarved, quiet, and empty of a finalized story. True liberation is not the arrival at a perfect destination, but the realization that the unspun fiber is completely whole while it rests in its raw nature. Right now, if it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, sulfurting air fill the bottom of your lungs without forcing a specific rhythm or an artificial depth. There is absolutely no need to solve your whole life tonight, and nothing is required of you except to notice how heavy it has been to carry this phantom future for so many years. Maybe you have felt this too, this sudden, hollow ache of staring at old photographs or tracking the vivid paths of strangers online, while your immediate reality feels completely detached, cold, and drowning in stagnation. But you are safe enough to soften the rigid muscles across your chest right now. You do not have to manufacture a new direction to prove your validity before your eyes are allowed to close. The darkness has no deadlines for you to meet. Imagine a bundle of unspun, raw hemp fibers left resting on a dark, cool cedar shelf in an alpine weaver's hut for decades. These crude, loose strands have remained entirely untouched by the spinning wheel, never twisted into coarse twine, and never forced into the rigid interlocking grids of a traditional valley garment. While the other bundles were pulled down into the valley, died in hot cauldrons, and stretched under immense tension on the weaving frames. This single cluster has simply remained in the high shadows, completely open and unformed. From the perspective of the marketplace, this hemp is incomplete, a raw material that has failed to achieve its functional purpose. But the fibers themselves remain remarkably soft, absorbing the deep, smoky fragrance of the hearth and the cool moisture of the alpine nights, entirely free from the structural strain of the machine. This is exactly how your nervous system becomes paralyzed when you treat your unchosen paths as a concrete loss, viewing your safe choices as a permanent cage that has ruined your true identity. The hollow emptiness behind your breastbone is not an indicator that your existence has been wasted. It is merely the sign that your awareness is being called to drop beneath the tension of your imagined timelines, returning to the unformed shelf where the spirit can rest in its own unspun nature. Finding peace within this space requires no frantic effort to redirect your career, no forced displays of boldness, and no intellectual explanations for your past caution. In a moment, we will explore this profound transition through the story of an ancient bellsmith who lived alone in a high foundry, learning that an iron mountain compass does not lose its true nature just because its magnetic needle has been completely demagnetized by a lightning strike. Let your body sink completely into the dark as we travel to a drafty, windswept peak where the charcoal dust rests in the quiet morning, deep within a high-altitude, windswept iron foundry, built against the sheer north face of a jagged peak. A middle-aged monk named Shinji lived in a state of quiet, unvoiced desolation. For 20 winters, Shinji had served the monastery as its head clerk, spending his days in flawless administrative obedience, maintaining the ledgers, verifying the tithes, and ensuring the absolute security of the institutional finances to his peers. He was the embodiment of dependable caution, a man who never made an error or took an unauthorized risk. Yet, behind his immaculate ledgers and mild expression, a cold, hollow vacuum had carved itself directly beneath his breastbone. Shinji was consumed by a hidden, smoldering sorrow over an artistic life as a metal carver that he had abandoned in his youth to choose the safe, predictable path of institutional approval. Every evening, as the bookkeeping lamps were extinguished, he would lie awake with a heavy, paralyzing regret, feeling like a phantom spectator who had watched his own true existence pass him by from behind a wall of numbers. The physical focus of Shinji's internal torment during these silent midnights was a heavy iron mountain compass that rested on a low cedar workbench in the corner of the foundry. This rugged instrument was housed in a thick brass casing, but during a violent summer storm 3 seasons ago, a stray bolt of lightning had struck the high foundry roof, completely demagnetizing the delicate iron needle. Instead of locking firmly onto the cold northern magnetic lines to provide a clear, reliable path through the high alpine passes, the needle now spun freely, drifting aimlessly in lazy, irregular circles whenever the housing was moved. To Shinji's hypervigilant intellect, the ruined compass was a terrifyingly exact mirror of his own adult life. He viewed the demagnetized needle as his own drifting, wasted spirit, an instrument that had completely lost its true heading and was now incapable of ever reaching its intended destination. Instead of experiencing his clerical duties as a form of focused meditation, Shinji approached every entry in the ledger books as an agonizing confirmation of his own cowardice. Staring at the straight, unyielding rows of ink, his mind would endlessly reconstruct the distant crossroads of his youth, replaying the exact moment he turned away from the raw, uncertain world of the carver's forge to accept the safe sanctuary of the office. He treated these phantom futures as an absolute truth, convincing himself that if he had only possessed the bravery to choose the unmapped path, his present landscape would be filled with an immaculate, vibrant fulfillment. This circular interrogation left his chest, feeling entirely stagnant, cold, and dead, as if the true substance of his life had been permanently left behind in a valley he could no longer reach. When the dark hour before dawn arrived, bringing a bitter, freezing draft that made the heavy timber pillars of the foundry creak, Shinji could no longer endure the weight of his unattempted history. He rose from his straw mat and walked across the grit-stained floorboards to the central forge room, where the air was thick with the scent of cold sulfur dust, charcoal ash, and the damp chill of wet canvas cloths used to smother the embers. Sitting beside a dead hearth was Master Enshin, an elderly, blind bellsmith who had spent his entire life working on this high peak, completely blind to the visual world, navigating the foundry entirely by the shifting sound of cooling bronze and the raw texture of the unrefined ore. Enshin did not offer him a traditional piece of advice, nor did he instruct him to repent for his lack of courage. He sat perfectly motionless on a low wooden bench, his weathered hands resting open on his knees, entirely unbothered by the great visible achievements of the famous monasteries in the lowlands. When Shinji placed the demagnetized iron compass into the old man's lap, confessing the deep, hollow sorrow of his unlived life and the crushing regret of choosing safety over his true calling, the blind smith did not express pity. Instead, he lifted his calloused thumbs, feeling the cold, heavy contours of the brass housing, and gently tapped the side of the casing with his fingernail, listening to the high, clear ring of the metal. Without a single word of criticism, the old master did not attempt to remagnetize the iron or force the needle back into a rigid north alignment. Moving with a heavy, dense slow motion, Enshin simply tilted the compass completely sideways, allowing the unanchored needle to swing past its old coordinates, spinning freely without any resistance until it came to rest, pointing toward the open wooden window, where the dark mountain mist was pouring into the room. He held the unmapped instrument perfectly still in his open palm, turned his sightless eyes toward Shinji's tense face, and spoke in a low, resonant whisper that seemed to echo through the cold iron vessels of the forge. Why do you scold this needle for losing its north, when its true nature is not the narrow destination it was meant to find, but the absolute freedom to point toward the vast unwritten sky without being held by an invisible chain? Shinji stood entirely paralyzed in the drafty foundry, the scent of the cold charcoal dust filling his lungs as a sudden, sharp moment of emotional recognition opened directly behind his breastbone. He looked down at the iron needle resting peacefully in the dark mist, completely untethered from the invisible magnetic currents that forced every other compass in the world to maintain a rigid, predictable line. He realized that the alternate life he had been mourning for 20 winters was just an intellectual design, a phantom grid he had been using to turn his immediate reality into a permanent prison. The cold, hollow vacuum beneath his sternum gave way to a soft, unraveled lightness, leaving his ribcage to expand within the heavy quiet of the mountain, no longer needing an immaculate destination to know that his presence was completely whole. The iron needle that instantly swung past its old coordinates within that demagnetized casing is not a hidden command to freeze your human heart into complete indifference. Nor does it ask you to become a cold, unfeeling shadow that pretends it has never known the devastating ache of an unlived life or the heavy stagnation of a safe path. This ancient young clerk's realization is pointing towards something infinitely quieter, illuminating the precise way we turn our unmade choices into an invisible prison, and how we can find peace when we stop trying to anchor our identity to a ghost. The heavy, hollow vacuum you feel sitting directly behind your breastbone tonight is not a proof that your existence has been wasted or that you are too late to experience a profound completeness. It is simply the natural emotional manifestation of holding a loose bundle of raw hemp fibers under constant, exhausting evaluation, trying to force your spirit to match a rigid design that never actually materialized in the physical world. We spend an immense amount of our nightly vitality attempting to remagnetize a destination that was struck down years ago, completely forgetting that some lives find their true purpose by simply losing their north, letting the unanchored needle point toward the vast, unwritten sky without any resistance. True Buddhist wisdom, when translated into the immediate, unvarnished language of your private disorientation, helps us see that our deepest exhaustion does not emerge from the simple reality that we chose caution over risk during an old crossroads in our youth. That choice was simply a historical action made out of a natural human desire for safety, as natural as the charcoal dust that settles on the foundry benches when the fire burns low. The true suffering was not only in what happened, not only in the reality of your quiet, conventional routine, but in the desperate, agonizing way the mind held what happened, treating your immediate existence as a permanent waiting room, and viewing your unchosen tracks as an immaculate paradise. You falsely believe that if you can just run your mind in circular loops long enough, you can somehow undo the caution of your past and force an alternate timeline to give you its validation. When you spend your late night hours staring at old photographs, comparing your quiet reality with the vivid paths of strangers online, or feeling an acute wave of shame because you did not blossom with a dramatic boldness, you are independently adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, unpolished reality of your regret, the natural fact that you feel a quiet sorrow for the unattempted road, and that you do not always possess the absolute certainty that your choices were the right ones. The second wound is what your own intellect manufactures when it takes that natural emptiness and turns it into a terrifying proof of personal cowardice, scolding your spirit for its safety and assuming you must be a permanent failure because your life has remained unspun. You take the blunt knife of self-judgment and continuously tighten the cords around your chest, bruising your own heart to prove you can still feel the texture of an alternate destiny. True awareness begins the exact moment you pause that frantic, internal management and allow your unlived history to exist without an immediate requirement to be corrected or justified. Wisdom is acting like the blind bellsmith who does not demand that the iron compass be forced back into an artificial alignment, but instead recognizes that the instrument fulfills its nature completely by simply letting the needle spin past its old restrictions. It is the realization that your fundamental validity as a living presence is not a linear track to be completed, nor does it require you to manifest a grand, visible harvest to remain attached to the ground. The moment you stop treating your unique, quiet melancholy as an active indictment of your worth, the hollow vacuum behind your breastbone naturally begins to relinquish its density. This quiet shift transforms your relationship with your unchosen futures entirely, changing an old somatic panic into a profound, self-compassionate reclamation of your original, unformed freedom. Compassion is the soft, protective understanding that allows your heart to feel the ancient ache of lost time, without assuming that you have actually ruined your true self in the wide eyes of the universe. The old metalsmith did not demand that Shinji become a famous carver, or pretend his internal stagnation had never existed. He simply showed him that the freedom to point toward the sky exists from the inside out, completely ignoring the artificial grids we try to construct out of fear. You do not need to rewrite your history or project a flawless monument of courage to be whole. Tonight, you can simply allow the loose threads of your imagined timelines to float away in the dark, letting your chest expand within the deep, unspun peace of the heavy earth. If it feels right to you at this moment, let your awareness gently drift away from the exhausting narrative of who you should have become, and settle entirely within the immediate, physical environment of your resting body. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of absolute stillness, or to approach this quiet moment as if it were an intricate test that you must pass before you are allowed to sleep. You are simply a tired living presence, allowing your shoulders to yield to the surface beneath you, permitting the bed to assume the entire responsibility of holding your weight. Perhaps you might begin by tuning into the slow, organic movement of your breath, simply observing the slight, cool touch of air at the back of your throat and the quiet, heavy release that follows each unhurried cycle. As you breathe out, you might invite the heavy, hollow vacuum behind your breastbone to soften its protective grip, even just a tiny fraction of an inch. There is no need to aggressively strip away the underlying melancholy or to scold your heart for feeling empty, for even the simple act of noticing the hollow space is completely enough to begin a gentle decompression. If you feel a restless momentum in your thoughts, a persistent urge to figure out how you can salvage your unchosen path tomorrow to maintain your significance, do not try to suppress that impulse. Just let that frantic pacing exist within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention, recognizing that this static is merely the place where your nervous system has been storing the accumulated tension of holding an unspun bundle of hemp fibers under constant, exhausting evaluation. Perhaps, as you rest in this dim space, a very specific memory of a past crossroads, an unvoiced calling, or a recent moment of intense regret will drift into the center of your mind. When it arrives, there is no need to follow it down into the dark, familiar loops of overthinking, and you do not have to fight it to prove your spiritual strength. Just let the thought be seen for what it is, imagining it as a loose, unencored swing of that demagnetized iron needle that spins freely inside its casing without any resistance. You might give this recurring emotional pattern a soft internal name, saying to yourself, "This is the old habit of trying to build an empire out of ghosts," or "This is the fear of letting my immediate reality be completely unformed." By naming the pattern without judgment, you are gently creating a soft, protective distance between the awareness that observes and the outdated personal timeline that is passing away. Imagine now that the rigid, external boundaries and past choices you have been carrying for years are beginning to lose their grip on your identity. If it feels right, you might visualize the elaborate, tightly braided rope of your life story, with all its regretted choices and unattempted roads gently beginning to unknot itself right before your eyes. There is no need to force this structure away with violence. You can simply watch the individual strands separate, relaxing and loosening until the entire braid softens into a cloud of soft, unspun wool drifting soundlessly through a dark forest canopy. Watch it settle into the damp green canopy, where the mountain air naturally diffuses the individual threads, allowing the fiber to dissolve slowly and quietly back into raw, unconditioned potentiality. Feel the subtle, shifting relief as the pressure pulls away from the center of your sternum, leaving your throat feeling remarkably light, porous, and entirely free from the requirement to maintain a permanent monument of destiny. With your next long, effortless exhalation, you can choose to place the specific burden of your lost time directly onto that unspun bundle of hemp, resting quietly on the dark cedar shelf. Picture the vast, loose cluster of fibers being gently lifted away into the night air by a passing alpine breeze, letting the empty space on the wood remain completely unmanaged without any consequence to the world. Let the imagery change in its own time as you watch the faint rectangular impression left in the soft dust return to complete blankness, entirely free from the intense tension of the machine. You do not need to do any of the active work of completing the pattern or defending your utility. You can simply watch the cool shadows close quietly over the empty space, leaving your awareness to merge with the unyielding gravity of the earth. There is no promise that your internal loneliness will completely dissolve into the air tonight, and there is no requirement to experience a sudden, dramatic breakthrough of emotional healing before you are allowed to close your eyes. The intention behind this gentle inner practice is simply to help you inhabit your own skeleton with a little less friction, showing your nervous system that it is entirely safe to step down from the stage of your old performance for the next few hours. You can return to this soft, downward letting go whenever you notice your mind being pulled back into the cold workshops of historical obligation. Or you can simply let the visualization fade completely from your thoughts, returning your focus to the simple, physical reality of the cool, sulfurtinged air expanding your ribcage. Your life does not belong to a permanent, unyielding theater, and your value as a living presence is not dependent on your ability to force yourself back into a narrow timeline that has become too small for your spirit. As the heavy weights of expectation are set down into the forge, the space that opens up behind your breastbone is not a terrifying void, but a soft, luminous freedom that has never forgotten how to breathe for itself. Let your arms and legs grow increasingly heavy, as if you are sinking into a deep bed of damp mountain soil that grows completely undisturbed by the patterns woven in old social ledgers. But there is still a deeper transformation waiting to reveal itself, a shift that moves from the softening of the fiber to the complete acceptance of the unbaked clay. Now let this high mountain wisdom come slightly closer to your contemporary heart as we prepare to look at a second, deeper journey that took place within an overgrown orchard where the wild brambles rest in absolute silence. 3 summers after the demagnetized compass had been left to rest by the open window of the forge, Shinji walked far past the high boundaries of the monastic courtyard, descending toward a steep, forgotten eastern slope where the mountain fell away into a series of crumbling earth terraces. Despite the quiet space he had found while listening to the blind bellsmith, a stubborn, sharp splinter still remained lodged directly beneath his throat, a persistent, quiet dread that because he had chosen administrative safety over artistic creation, his true capacity was completely dead, leaving his life to remain a collection of blank pages that could never be filled. He had walked all morning through a heavy alpine mist, carrying a wooden spade and a roll of rough hemp netting, tasked with clearing a blocked water channel that fed a low-altitude vegetable patch. He hoped the rhythmic mudwork would numb the agonizing habit of comparing his quiet clerical existence with the vivid, expressive paths of the carvers down in the valley town, terrified that his time was running out. The physical focus of Shinji's deep internal conflict on this wet hillside was a heavy rectangular block of unbaked gray brick clay mixed with river straw, which had been left sitting under a rotting canvas cloth behind an abandoned tile kiln. This piece of mountain earth was a cubit wide, its unfinished surface displaying the coarse, rough texture of the river silt from which it had been dug seasons ago. The left corner of the block was crumbling, washed away by the heavy autumn rains, while the rest of the mass lay heavily embedded in the damp, freezing weeds below, never having been placed inside the fire to become a hardened, useful tile. As Shinji stood over it in the drizzle, his mud-stained fingers touching the cold, slippery flank of the clay, his mind instantly fell into the old punishing groove. He saw the unbaked block as an exact, terrifying mirror of his own unlived existence, raw, formless, and left behind in the weeds while others were transformed into beautiful structures. The terraced slope was wrapped in a dense, shifting blanket of white fog that smelled intensely of crushed green briar leaves, wet alpine slate, and the cold mineral tang of waterlogged loam. There were no immaculate stone borders to follow along this vertical face. The hillside had been completely abandoned to the elements, and the only certainty was the low, continuous trickle of muddy water soaking into the root systems of the wild brambles. As the freezing moisture began to seep through the wool of his underrobes, a massive wave of internal resistance tightened across Shinji's chest. His intellect began to fiercely construct a series of defensive explanations, convincing him that he had to abandon his monastery duties entirely to seek a late artistic career in the town, treating his own protective, frantic thoughts as an absolute truth. He was gripping the wooden handle of his spade so tightly that his knuckles turned white, desperate to smash the unformed brick to ease the sting in his heart. Sheltered from the bitter eastern draft by a low ledge of rock, Shinji encountered an old, reclusive mountain gardener named Soken, a man who spent his remaining years living in a rough timber liento, tending a terrace of wild, non-fruiting brambles simply to hold the mountain slope together after the winter mudslides. Soken did not offer him a warm beverage to soothe his shivering frame, nor did he attempt to give him a piece of advice regarding his lost years. Moving with a heavy, deliberate slow motion that seemed to share the ancient patience of the soil, the old gardener reached down under the wet canvas cloth and lifted the heavy block of unbaked gray brick clay, holding it flat in his bare, wrinkled palms. Without a single sound of evaluation, the old gardener did not try to smooth the crumbling corners or carry the block toward the mouth of the cold kiln. Moving his thumb across the raw river straw with absolute quiet, he gently broke a soft, unformed piece of the clay from the side of the mass and pressed it directly into a deep, leaking crack in the wooden water channel, where the mountain current was tearing the soil away from the terrace. He looked directly into Shinji's wide, anxious eyes, his weathered face entirely untroubled by the great visible achievements of the valley carvers, and simply pointed his finger down toward the massive, subterranean root system of the brambles that held the entire mountain from collapsing into the abyss. Shinji felt a sudden, sharp release behind his sternum, his intellect spinning with the habit of viewing his unlived life as a tragic failure that had to be frantically corrected through a sudden act of boldness. But as he looked at the unbaked clay held tightly in Soken's hands, seeing how the unformed river silt was fulfilling its purpose completely by simply remaining soft, flexible, and willing to plug the wound of the hill, he caught his breath mid-stride. He took a long, slow, horizontal inhalation of the briar-scented fog, making a conscious, deliberate choice to stop the lifelong habit of treating his own bitter conclusions as an absolute reality. Instead of trying to force his history into a beautiful design or run away from the terrace, he relaxed his fingers, letting the wooden spade drop soundlessly into the wet grass. He chose to simply sit with the deep, unpolished uncertainty of his missing years, sitting with the discomfort of his unmade choices without pretending the old hurt did not happen. The transformation did not magically rewrite his past decisions, nor did it grant him a sudden position of artistic fame within the Valley workshops. It changed the entire way he related to the hot friction between his shoulders. As he sat quietly in the freezing mist beside the reclusive gardener, seeing the unbaked clay laid gently back under the damp canvas cloth, he realized that his true presence was not a linear track that had to be completed by a grand production. He stopped the exhausting habit of treating his existence as an unfinished product, choosing instead to anchor his awareness in the raw, unconditioned potential that fed the mountain from the dark. A profound wave of self-forgiveness settled into his bones, leaving him resting on the wet slope, no longer needing to build a monument to know that his space was completely whole. This quiet stillness beside the wet earth terraces of wild briars reveals the exact psychological grid that keeps your own thoughts spinning in a state of high nocturnal vigilance tonight. When you observe that unbaked block of gray river silt resting under its rotting canvas cloth, its raw edges completely indifferent to the burning heat of the kiln, you are looking directly at the anatomy of your own emotional exhaustion. The great delusion of our conventional conditioning is the belief that to be a complete, valid human being, your life path must produce a highly visible, hardened monument of achievement. We treat the simple reality of our unmade choices, the sudden arrival of our regret, and the heavy sorrow of our untaken roads not as a normal part of life's natural variance, but as a terrifying proof of personal cowardice, turning the quiet space of our unlived potential into an active indictment of our worth. The emotional engine that drives this night paralysis is a frantic, unconscious craving to control an inherently changing and unmeasured reality. When you lie awake in your room, your intellect spends its vital energy aggressively rehearsing future scenarios where you might look unaccomplished, or replaying past crossroads to check for the exact moment the line shifted away from your true desires. You take the high standards of a manufactured competence and turn them into a tool of deep self-judgment, scolding your heart for its safety and trying to fix your uncarved identity through a sense of structural shame. This constant effort to build an empire out of ghosts creates a profound, agonizing split in your awareness, causing you to turn the pain of missing time into a permanent personal identity, as if you are a flawed instrument left to drift aimlessly without a north. By illuminating this mechanical process, the relationship you hold with your own internal emptiness begins to undergo a profound, comforting transformation. Buddhist wisdom cuts through all academic complexity by dividing our emotional experience into two distinct dimensions: the initial pain that life naturally brings to our doorstep, and the secondary suffering that our own mind independently adds through its fierce resistance to reality. The first pain consists of the raw, unpolished conditions of your present environment, the physical reality that time moves forward in a single direction, the natural grief that arises when an authentic calling is left unattempted, and the quiet weight of navigating a safe routine without an immediate resolution. These are the elements that you cannot always control, anticipate, or prevent, as they are part of the changing seasons of a developing life. The second pain, however, is the heavy, hollow vacuum that solidifies directly behind your breastbone, when your intellect refuses to let that initial unevenness simply exist without an aggressive interrogation. The second pain is what happens when you treat a single regretful thought as an absolute truth that must be solved before dawn, or when you use the very concepts of healing to scold your heart for feeling heavy in a world that has no permanent scorecards. When you spend your midnight hours trying to force an unspun bundle of hemp to maintain an immaculate design, you are actively feeding the second pain with your own hyper-vigilant attention, mistaking the natural arrival of rest for a personal failure. You are trying to remagnetize a compass needle with a broken heart that was always meant to return to its original, unperformed nature. True peace, when encountered in the deep space of the late hours, is never the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a sterile state of existence where no heavy thoughts ever cross the threshold of your mind. Peace is found by establishing a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives, learning to sit comfortably within the fog of your own choices, without needing to force an immediate new victory. You do not have to force your internal noise to become perfectly silent to deserve your rest tonight, and you do not need to project a towering monument of courage before your body is permitted to settle into the dark. The moment you can allow the frantic, comparative effort to look entirely functional to pause, the rigid scaffolding across your chest naturally relinquishes its density, allowing your attention to pool deeply in the center of your resting frame. You discover that your true, luminous presence is like that unbaked river clay, inherently whole, completely resilient, and entirely capable of holding the mountain together, precisely because it possesses the capacity to let the high winds pass through its structure without resistance. The deep, unlit vein of your awareness is moving safely beneath the competitive static at this very moment, completely uncompromised by the high expectations you have placed upon your chest, waiting only for you to pull your hands inside the perimeter of the raft and trust the shared root to hold you up. This high mountain wisdom, pulled from the unspun hemp fibers and the unbaked block of river clay, is not a collection of abstract ideas meant to be stored away in a quiet corner of your intellect while you listen to a steady voice in the darkness. It is a soft, practical cadence designed to be carried directly into the noisy, unpolished friction of your contemporary afternoon. True inner peace is never an elusive, monumental milestone that you master by permanently fixing your entire structural history. At once, it is practiced and reclaimed in the smallest, most ordinary pauses of your daily survival. It is found in that brief, hidden space that opens up between an empty hour that triggers your fear of stagnation and the sudden, reactive contraction that tightens directly behind your breastbone before you reach for your device to search for a new sign of validation. Think of how frequently the old habit of using a forced, conventional competence to hide your internal sense of emptiness returns to your side during a standard week, masquerading as the frantic urge to control a changing relationship when you are feeling entirely unanchored, or the exhausting effort of smiling brightly at a meeting while your inner landscape feels completely heavy, detached, and cold inside. You might notice this rigid armor locking into place when you are lying awake at night, waiting for a text message for reassurance or replaying an old career mistake. The mind quickly treats these moments of transition as a catastrophic personal deficiency, causing you to feel profoundly behind in life, as if you are a flawed engine that has failed to maintain the collective rotation around the social circle. We live in an accelerated environment that continuously pushes us to present an unyielding, perfectly optimized exterior to the world, leaving many of us feeling deeply lonely and hidden beneath the weight of our own historical velocity. Out of a fear of uncertainty, you might try to overanalyze a changing bond or fear an unwritten future, using the very concepts of self-care to judge your own natural fatigue. You treat your own changing capacity as a malfunctioning vessel that must be aggressively forced back into the traditional rhythm, convincing yourself that you must earn your right to absolute rest by first achieving a spotless state of external utility that leaves no room for raw, unpolished human transitions. But Buddhist insight gently invites you to step down from the stage of your old performance tomorrow, showing you that a single breath before answering a demanding message is a profound form of living wisdom that requires no professional credentials. You do not need to reshape your entire daily routine into a permanent engine of output to be worthy of your space on this earth, and you can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping their validation so tightly that your own nervous system remains in a state of constant, defensive tension. Not every hypervigilant thought that crosses your mind deserves your absolute obedience, and not every floating feeling of uselessness is an unshakable command that must be solved before the sun breaks through the window. You can rest without earning it first, letting go of the performative need to appear functional and allowing your unhewn stone to simply touch the ground. The next time you find yourself wanting rest but feeling an acute wave of guilt for resting, remember that the vastness of your true presence carries an innate capacity to hold both your longing for connection and your need for complete immobility together in the same wide channel, without requiring a flawless performance. This practical shift in your daily habit does not mean the complex realities of your modern schedule will suddenly lose their weight. It means you become a far more porous, resilient, and unbothered presence within your own skin, because your fundamental safety is no longer dependent on keeping your internal air vents blocked by an excess of structural panic. You are entirely permitted to let the world move on without your perfect supervision for the next few hours, letting go of the gears of your analytical thoughts and allowing your physical frame to sink into the heavy gravity of the evening. Let this realization soften the remaining scaffolding behind your jaw as the room around you grows increasingly cool, preparing your awareness to dissolve completely into the unlit source of the dark night. The faint, trace scent of cold sulfur dust that drifted through the room all evening has finally grown completely still, leaving the small gaps in the floor joints untouched by the slightest murmur of activity. The heavy, hollow vacuum that was anchoring itself directly behind your breastbone has lost its last remaining density, leaving nothing but a vast, porous emptiness where the old weight of your phantom futures used to rest. Your body feels immensely heavy against the linen, sinking steadily into the unyielding foundation of the mattress, as if your entire skeleton is finally relinquishing its long, performative vigil against the possibility of a missed destiny. You do not need to maintain the illusion of an immaculate direction. For the remainder of this night, you are entirely permitted to let the heavy, tensed scaffolding of your past choices collapse into the quiet dark. Let your breathing become an absolute whisper, a shallow and completely effortless tide that requires no tracking, no verification, and no intellectual intervention from your tired heart. The wild, unpruned brambles that stood along the steep earth terraces all summer are sitting in perfect immobility beneath the heavy alpine mist, their unformed roots holding the mountainside together without ever yielding a single piece of fruit. The frantic urge to organize the garden or defend an artificial design has dissolved into the open air, leaving the terrace slope to rest listlessly beneath the silent night sky, entirely unbothered by the wide, empty space of the ridge stretching out into the dark. The internal space behind your sternum is completely unmeasured, completely uncoupled, and entirely free from the requirement to hold a traditional scorecard for the timeline outside. You can stop trying to force an unspun life into a beautiful garment tonight. The rough, unshaped block of gray river clay has been left flat under its rotting canvas cloth behind the cold kiln, and there are no demagnetized needles left to force, no conventional expectations to satisfy, and no abandoned callings to repair with the frantic labor of your intellect. The dark layer of wet moss has settled completely over the stone windbreak, cutting off the old paths and leaving the immediate surface to rest in absolute, unresisting passivity. You do not have to bridge the gap between who you were and what you must manifest tomorrow before your eyes can close, because the true luminous depth of your awareness has never once been broken by the intensity of your historical caution. Sink down deeper into the stillness, letting the tiny muscles around your chest go entirely slack, letting the weight of your limbs dissolve into the mattress like loose hemp fibers, softening beneath the gentle moisture of an alpine night, leaving your lungs feeling cool, wide, and entirely spacious. The wild briars along the vertical slope are resting in the midnight drizzle, spreading their green leaves toward the darkness without a single thought of utility, completely content to exist exactly where the mountain dictates. You are returning home to an undivided baseline of presence that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by the brightness of your timeline, or turn a temporary wave of regret into an absolute proof of deficiency. This spacious ground is your original sanctuary, a timeless expanse that asks for no permanent ledgers of boldness, requires no immaculate displays of functioning, and demands no fixed faces to grant you rest. Allow yourself to slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, letting your name, your history, and your cognitive fatigue dissolve like loose strands floating away from the unspun bundle left in the high shadows of the weaver's hut. The low, continuous spin of the analytical mind trying to force the needle back to a rigid north has completely died away, leaving only the soft, cooling whisper of the mist passing through the wet canvas to soothe the rough knots of your being. You have full permission to leave your entire life story, completely unmanaged and uncorrected, until the sun climbs over the western cliffs, trusting the heavy, uncarved structure of your body to hold its own presence without your supervision. Let your mind go entirely dark, letting your soul drift down into the boundless, unlit quiet where you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. When the unspun hemp is left loose upon the dark cedar shelf, who can say that the unattempted thread has failed to hold up the sky? The thread itself remains completely undivided from the wide, silent atmosphere of the room, requiring no interlocking grid to be anchored to the ground. The analytical mind has spent years operating under the heavy conviction that you must continuously weave your presence into a tangible form, tracking your progress against the vivid tapestries of those around you, out of a profound fear that to remain unformed is to be forgotten. It spins an elegant story of what should have been, turning your quiet years into a heavy monument of lack and convincing your nervous system that every unchosen crossroad is a permanent scar on your true identity. But when you rest in the unmeasured space of this night, letting go of the entire project of self-construction, you begin to see that the vast sky of your awareness does not lose its depth just because a specific timeline was left unattempted. The mountain does not demand that the river silt become a hardened tile to earn its place along the terrace. It simply holds the clay in its raw, unbaked nature, letting the wild briars draw strength from its quiet density. Your essential completeness is like that heavy iron casing resting on the dark workbench, perfectly whole and beautiful even when its inner needle refuses to lock onto a rigid north. The choices you didn't make, the creative paths you felt too cautious to explore, and the quiet weight of your conventional routine were merely temporary designs sketched on a surface that remains completely uncompromised, spacious and free in its most sacred core. The long winters you spent replaying your old caution have not diminished your inner sanctuary by a single fraction, because the pure awareness that holds your breath has no destination to reach, and no deadlines that can be broken by the simple arrival of your exhaustion. When you allow the frantic necessity of constant comparison to fade into the dim light of the room, you are not losing your orientation. You are finally permitting your spirit to return to the unbroken baseline of its original freedom. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous self-interrogation can only view its quiet, unwritten spaces as a sign of failure, using the old mechanisms of internal judgment to force a tired, changing life back into an unyielding definition. By choosing to step down from the stage of your old performance for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the soft, grounding stability of the evening, letting the defensive scaffolding across your chest dissolve naturally at its own organic pace. You do not need to win the approval of the crowd or project a towering monument of courage before your body is permitted to settle into the dark, because your value as a living presence was already fully complete, long before you ever learned to score your achievements against another's light. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The remaining tightness that was clamping down behind your breastbone has completely lost its density, melting away like a handful of dry river straw, softening beneath the midnight moisture, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future encounters before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to mend every piece of your unlived history before your frame is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the bed. The dark night accepts your uncarved journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unanchored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical thoughts and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth is a finite resource that can be outshone by another, allowing your entire skeleton to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your unvoiced regrets are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low rustle of dry canvas, scraping against a piece of wet slate miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every scorecard is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. This peace is not a hard prize won at the end of a competitive road, but the baseline that remains when you stop measuring the worth of your existence against an imagined map. The analytical mind is incredibly skilled at constructing an idol out of the paths you turned away from, convincing your spirit that the true essence of your life exists only in a reality you did not touch. It looks at the uncarved block of clay or the loose bundle of fiber and registers a profound failure of execution, entirely blind to the truth that the ground does not require a finalized shape to remain unshakably secure beneath the mountain. Deep Buddhist realization cuts directly through this net of historical comparison, showing you that the awareness watching your regret is the very same vast luminous field that holds the entire sky, completely untarnished by the specific milestones you did not reach. You do not have to justify your past security or build a late monument of boldness to earn your place in this darkness. Your presence is fully complete, precisely because it contains the unformed potential of the unborn earth. When you allow your mind to step down from the exhausting task of auditing your youth, the heavy, hollow vacuum behind your breastbone naturally gives way to a soft, porous lightness that requires no validation from the valley below. You begin to understand that the alternate versions of yourself you have been mourning are merely intellectual designs, phantom frameworks that have no active life outside the narrow loops of your overthinking. The true substance of your being has never been trapped in an unattempted track. It is right here, resting safely within your own skin, fully complete even when your hands are empty of a grand, visible harvest. By letting the unanchored needle of your attention spin past its historical restrictions, you are not losing your way in the mist. You are finally allowing your nervous system to return to the quiet, unconditioned freedom that has always been your true birthright. Lie perfectly still in this raw alpine quiet, letting the remaining tension across your shoulders dissolve into the linen like soft gray clay returning to the riverbanks, allowing the bed to carry the entire weight of your unwritten history without any assistance. You do not have to solve the riddle of your missing years before your eyes are permitted to close, and nothing is required of you tonight, except to let your breath find its own shallow, effortless rhythm. The wild brambles along the terraced hillside are resting in absolute stillness beneath the midnight drizzle, their roots deep in the cold loam, completely untroubled by the fact that they have produced no fruit for the marketplace. They belong to the mountain simply because they are there, and you belong to this dark room in the exact same unperformed way, completely safe from the judgment of old ledgers and entirely free from the necessity to construct a destiny. Let your intellect drop its iron tools completely, letting the visualization of the loose hemp fibers fade naturally from your thoughts as your awareness pools deeply in the heavy center of your frame. The frantic necessity to appear functional, bold, or fully realized has run its course for the evening, leaving your chest to expand within a deep, unspun peace that knows no external deadlines and holds no expectations. You are drifting further and further into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every unchosen path is softly forgotten, Every heavy weight of regret is lifted, and your spirit is finally, beautifully at home in the unlit source of the night. Slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, trusting the unyielding gravity of the earth to hold your unformed life without any judgment, knowing that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. The darkness does not ask you to account for the space you have left uncarved, nor does it demand that you show a finished tapestry to be worthy of its rest. The analytical intellect has spent decades functioning like a rigid loom under intense tension, convincing you that your presence is a commodity that must be continuously woven into a visible, highly organized form to ensure your basic safety in the universe. It watches the unattempted road and registers a profound structural failure, transforming your natural human caution into a lifelong sentence of inner isolation and quiet shame. But deep Buddhist realization reveals that the pure awareness sitting quietly within your chest has never been a linear timeline to be completed. It is the wide, timeless sky in which all choices, made or unmade, appear and dissolve like white morning mist over the high ridges. You do not exist to manifest an immaculate destiny for the validation of the valley. Your presence is fully whole, even when you are entirely unspun, quiet, and empty of a finalized story. True liberation begins the exact moment you step down from the stage of your old performance, allowing the phantom futures you mourn to return to the unformed potentiality of the night air. The mind falsely insists that your identity is an unfinished consumer product that must be retroactively fixed to deserve peace, scolding your heart for its safety, and trying to mend your uncarved life through a sense of structural shame. But the old bellsmith does not demand that the demagnetized iron needle be forced back into a rigid north alignment. He simply lets it swing past its old coordinates, spinning freely without any invisible chains to hold its posture. When you stop treating your unique, quiet melancholy as an active indictment of your worth, the cold, hollow vacuum behind your breastbone naturally begins to relinquish its density, leaving your spirit to inhabit its own skeleton with a little less friction. Let your awareness drift entirely into the immediate physical environment of your resting body, permitting the bed to assume the entire responsibility of holding your weight without any assistance from your intellect. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of absolute stillness, or to approach this quiet moment as if it were an intricate test that you must pass before you are allowed to sleep. You are simply a tired living presence, allowing your shoulders to yield to the surface beneath you, watching your breath find its own shallow, effortless rhythm like the low rustle of dry canvas scraping against wet alpine slate miles away from your window pane. The wild brambles along the terraced hillside are resting in absolute immobility beneath the midnight drizzle, completely untroubled by the fact that they have produced no fruit for the marketplace. And you belong to this dark room in the exact same unperformed way. The remaining echoes of your family roles and past regrets are turning into faint, formless shadows now, losing their sharp perimeters and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future encounters before your eyes are allowed to close. And you do not need to prove that you are an exceptionally bold or grounded person to deserve the comfort of this stillness. The dark night wraps its arms completely around your exhaustion, offering you a timeless shelter where your name, your history, and your cognitive fatigue can all be gently laid down like an unpolished iron vessel left on a cold stone floor. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every scorecard is softly forgotten, every heavy weight of regret is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, trusting the unyielding gravity of the earth to hold your unformed life without any judgment, knowing that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. The silence of the night expands around you like a vast, unmapped ocean that has never required a shoreline to know its own depth. The analytical mind spent years running its machinery under the false assumption that your consciousness is a vessel that must be filled to the brim with active achievements, bold choices, and definitive forms to be considered valid by the world outside. It looks back at the unchosen paths of your youth and translates that quiet space into an unpardonable emptiness, convincing your nervous system that you are living a shadow existence, forever separated from the true substance of your being. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that the awareness watching this internal narrative is not a collection of things you did or did not do. It is the pristine, untouched space of the unborn. The open sky that remains completely unaltered, whether it holds a brilliant constellation or a heavy, dark cloud of autumn mist. Your true identity has never been a product to be completed by your own willpower. It is the timeless witness in which all seasons of your life appear, drift, and dissolve back into the unformed quiet without leaving a single scar upon your core completeness. When you allow the frantic necessity of constant self-auditing to pause for the remainder of this evening, the heavy, cave-like vacuum behind your breastbone naturally softens into a soft, porous freedom that has no requirement to justify its caution. You begin to see that the alternative paths you mourn were never solid realities, but intellectual sketches, phantom tapestries woven out of memory and fear that have no active breath outside the narrow loops of late-night overthinking. The true substance of your life is not a linear track that was broken by your past decisions. It is right here, resting securely within the weight of your own body, fully present and completely whole, even when you are entirely uncarved, quiet, and empty of a definitive destiny. By letting the unanchored needle of your attention spin freely past its historical coordinates, you are not losing your way in the high fog. You are finally permitting your spirit to return to the original, unconditioned sanctuary that has never known a single deadline. Lie perfectly still in this raw alpine environment, letting the remaining tightness across your chest dissolve into the mattress like soft, unbaked gray clay returning to the quiet riverbanks, allowing the bed to assume the entire responsibility of holding your unwritten history without any assistance from your intellect. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of absolute serenity before your eyes are permitted to close, and nothing is required of you tonight except to watch your breath find its own shallow, effortless rhythm. The wild brambles along the terraced hillside are resting in absolute immobility beneath the midnight drizzle, their roots deep in the cold loam, completely unbothered by the fact that they have produced no fruit for the marketplace. They belong to the mountain simply because they are there. And you belong to this dark room in the exact same unperformed way, completely safe from the judgment of old ledgers and entirely free from the necessity to construct an immaculate story. Let your intellect drop its iron tools completely, letting the visualization of the loose hemp fibers fade naturally from your thoughts as your awareness pools deeply in the heavy center of your resting frame. The frantic necessity to appear functional, bold, or fully realized has run its course for the evening, leaving your ribcage to expand within a deep, unspun peace that knows no external expectations and holds no boundaries. You are drifting further and further into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every unchosen path is softly forgotten, every heavy weight of regret is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the unlit source of the night. Slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, trusting the unyielding gravity of the earth to hold your unformed life without any judgment, knowing that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace.